In 1990, the Wildcats had won at least 5 games for the first time since 1982, and won 2 conference games for the first time since 1984. But still, skeptics abounded. After all, it was only 1 year of success, and they only won 5 games. It was probably just a flash in the pan. 1 year doesn't undo an entire history of futility. This kind of thinking led to preseason publications like Street and Smith picking Kansas State to finish 6th in the Big 8 in 1991. But still, 6th isn't 8th. Perhaps the Wildcats could win a couple conference games. But the Snyder plan was working. Little did the experts know that they were selling K-State short. When all the skeptics thought the Wildcats would just roll over and die, it turns out K-State hadn't even begun to fight. In 1991, the Wildcats returned the Big 8's newcomer of the year, Jamie Mendez, who had led the conference in interceptions in 1990 with 6, as well as Brooks Barta, the team leader in tackles. Offensively, the Wildcats returned their entire offensive line from 1990, anchored by center Quentin Newyear. However, quarterback Carl Shaw was gone. He'd be replaced by senior Paul Watson. His backfield mate would be Eric Gallen, who Snyder had moved from receiver to running back. Michael Smith also returned to anchor the receiving corps. Also before the 91 season, Snyder promoted Jim Levitt and Bob Stoops to co-defensive coordinator. Kansas State got the season started on the right foot, winning their first game. In fact, they won their first 3, their longest winning streak since, you guessed it, 1982. The reason for the hot start was simple: scheduling. In the past, K-State had filled its non-conference schedule with paycheck games in order to keep the program afloat. But Snyder insisted on scheduling winnable games. The teams that Kansas State beat? Indiana State and Idaho State, both 1AA opponents, and Northern Illinois, who had finished 2-9 in 1991. While K-State would get pummeled by number 4 Washington in the next game, they entered conference play with a winning record for the second time in as many seasons. Their conference opener was against rival Kansas. The game turned out to be a defensive struggle. The Wildcats fell behind and were down by 2 scores in the fourth quarter, but Kansas State didn't give up. A Paul Watson pass to Andre Coleman gave the Wildcats the lead, but the Jayhawks wouldn't go quietly into that good night. On the last play of the game, K-State's defense had to hold on for dear life.
Florell throwing for the end zone. The pass is knocked away. K-State wins. K-State wins. The Wildcats win it in a miracle finish. The Wildcats come back down from 12-3 and win it. And they beat the Kansas Jayhawks 16-12. Roger Green knocked down the pass. And what it is, it's a big win for Kansas State.
The 16-12 victory was their first over KU since 1986, and the first time they had opened conference play with a victory since 1979. It was their 6th home win in a row, the most consecutive home victories since 1921. But now, K-State had to face a gauntlet. 3 ranked teams in 3 consecutive weeks. First was Nebraska. Huskers fans were used to seeing their team demolish the Wildcats, as they would regularly beat them by 50 or more. But it didn't take long for Nebraska to find out that this wasn't your older brother's Wildcats, as the game was tied at 17 at halftime. Surely the fans watching expected the deeper, more talented team to impose their will in the second half, but what they got was more clawing and scraping from the tenacious Wildcats. In fact, as the fourth quarter started, Kansas State held a 7-point lead on the road in Lincoln. But a couple strong Nebraska drives gave the Huskers the lead for good, with just under 3 minutes left in the game. However, Nebraska couldn't breathe easy just yet. It wasn't over until a 4th down attempt by Paul Watson fell incomplete at the goal line with less than a minute to go in the game. Nebraska prevailed 38-31. Kansas State, a 35-point underdog, only lost by a touchdown. In spite of the loss, it was the most points Kansas State had ever scored against Nebraska. Michael Smith gained 142 receiving yards against the vaunted Blackshirts. The performance was so impressive that the Memorial Stadium crowd got to their feet and gave the upstart Wildcats a standing ovation. Nebraska fans understood what was going on in Manhattan. It was only a matter of time until the rest of the country found out as well. The next week, Kansas State took on defending national champion Colorado at home and only lost by 10. Following a loss the next week to Oklahoma, Kansas State's record stood at 4-4. Next up was Iowa State, who had a similar record at 3-4-1, and Kansas State crushed them 37-7. They proceeded to manhandle Missouri and take down Oklahoma State to finish the season 7-4. The only games they lost all season were to ranked teams. In spite of securing their first winning season in a decade, the Wildcats weren't selected for a bowl game after finishing 4th in the Big 8. But still, there wasn't a K-State fan alive that wouldn't have called the season a success. Defensively, the Wildcats continued their positive trajectory, giving up only 20 points per game, down from 41 per game in 1988. Offensively, Eric Gallen broke the 1,000-yard mark, the first running back to do so at Kansas State since Isaac Jackson in 1973. Michael Smith also set the conference mark for career receiving yards, setting a precedent for something else that Kansas State would take advantage of in the Snyder era: the walk-on. Michael Smith was the first in a long line of super productive players who started their careers at Kansas State as walk-ons. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In 1992, Gallen returned at running back, but gone were center Quentin Newyear, receiver Michael Smith, and quarterback Paul Watson, and the passing game suffered. Brooks Barta and Jamie Mendez returned to anchor the defense. Once again, the Wildcats started the season with 3 straight wins thanks to their soft schedule, but went just 2-6 the rest of the way, only winning 2 conference games. But even with their losing record, the Wildcats hit another benchmark, the first undefeated season at home since 1934. Also in '92, Bill Snyder's son, punter Sean Snyder, became the first-team All-American of the Snyder era, and Kansas State's first since 1977. Before the '92 season, Sports Illustrated had declared that Kansas State was reborn. But the truth is that they were a year off, because in 1993, K-State produced one of the best years in the history of the program. After easy wins against New Mexico State and Western Kentucky, the Wildcats faced their first test against Minnesota, a test they would pass 30-25. After a win against UNLV gave Kansas State their first 4-0 start since 1931, a win the following week over Kansas made them 5-0 and earned them their first appearance in the AP rankings in 23 years. Next, K-State had to face the Big 8's Big 3, the 3 teams they could never beat: Nebraska, Colorado, and Oklahoma. First up was number 6 Nebraska, led by quarterback Tommy Frazier. Even though Nebraska took a 17-point lead, those pesky Wildcats wouldn't go away. The immaculate passing of Chad May kept the Wildcats in it until a late goal line stand by the Huskers. May set the conference record for passing yards in the loss with 489. It was also the most yards ever gained through the air by a Nebraska opponent. Don't let the final score fool you. This was a close game until the end. The next week, they tied 16th-ranked Colorado, and after that, number 14 Oklahoma came to Manhattan for the first time since 1987. The series had been played in Norman for 6 consecutive years because attendance had been so poor in Manhattan that Kansas State actually got more money from playing on the road and getting the smaller cut than they did from playing at home. But by 1993, the fans were flooding into KSU Stadium, and they were treated to a stunning victory over the Sooners as the Wildcats beat Oklahoma for the first time in 23 years.
Looks right, throws near side, the pass is broken up by Chuck Marlowe. This ball game's over. This ball game's over, and you listen to me closely. Listen to me closely, because for the first time since Exodus chapter 14, the Red Sea has been parted, and Pharaoh's Sooner chariots have been swallowed up, because Bill Moses Snyder says, let my people go from 23 years of Sooner bondage.
It was Snyder's first win over a ranked team and Kansas State's first since 1981. They closed out the regular season with a loss to Iowa State and wins over Missouri and Oklahoma State. Their 8-2-1 record was good enough for the program's second-ever bowl appearance. The Wildcats were headed to the Copper Bowl, where their opponent would be WAC champion Wyoming, who boasted a high-flying offense and the NCAA's active leader in receiving yards. And Kansas State pummeled them. Behind the versatile play of receiver Andre Coleman and the arm of Chad May, the Wildcats won 52-17. 3 Wildcats were named All-Americans in '93. Andre Coleman on special teams and Jamie Mendez and Thomas Randolph on defense. The Wildcats finished ranked for the first time ever. They won 9 games for the first time since 1910. Taking all this into account, as well as the program's first bowl victory, 1993 was arguably the best season in Kansas State history. Technically, the turnaround was complete. But it's one thing to become successful, and another to maintain that success. Could Snyder maintain the program's newfound status? The answer was yes. Even with the departure of stars like Jamie Mendez and Andre Coleman, K-State finished the regular season 9-2, with their only losses to eventual national champion Nebraska and 11-1 Colorado. In spite of a bowl loss to Boston College, the Wildcats finished ranked for the second straight year. J.J. Smith gained 1,000 yards on the ground, and Chad May led the Big Eight in passing yards and touchdowns. 1995 was the same song, just a different verse. Even with All-American Chad May gone, the Wildcats found a way. They started the season with 6 straight wins before dropping one to Nebraska. It didn't faze the Wildcats, though, as they blew out number 6 Kansas and Oklahoma in consecutive weeks. After dropping the conference finale to Colorado, Kansas State finished the job by beating Colorado State in the Holiday Bowl, completing their first 10-win season since 1910, only the second in school history. 3 more Wildcats were All-Americans in 1995, all on defense. In fact, the defense was so successful that Snyder lost both his defensive coordinators to other jobs. Not only would Snyder have to replace some assistants going into '96, the Wildcats would also be joining the newly created Big 12 Conference. Change was in the air all around the Wildcats, but it didn't slow down the winning one bit. In fact, things were about to go nuclear.